The NES and the SNES Classic Editions are both a heck of a mess of fun, but since I'm a dick, I'm gonna put these two beloved things in head-to-head competition with each other in an attempt to find out which is ultimately superior. So let's not waste any more time and dive right into answering the 14th most important question in human history of which mini console's better, the NES Classic Edition or the SNES Classic Edition. Cause fuck liking two separate things at once, am I right? I'm sure people on both sides of the fence think that their favorite console is an easy choice, but there's a lot to consider when comparing the two classic editions besides what the game selections are. But before we get into the game selections, let me just say that I'm only going to be comparing the base consoles, and I'm not even going to consider which classic editions are better after modding or hacking them, because that's illegal and I'll report anybody who even thinks about doing that. However, if you must mod your classic edition consoles, then at least watch the videos I made on which games you should add to your lineup, along with another video I made on why you should do it. With that being said though, I'm going to determine the winner by awarding points in 5 different categories, where things are going to be tied up by the time we get to the 5th and deciding point for the sake of artificial suspense. Because that's what every other YouTuber does with these types of videos for some reason, and I'm trying to go viral, baby. So for point number 1, let's start off with the first thing that anybody considers before buying anything: the price. The NES Classic's $60 and the SNES Classic's $80. However, it's kinda weird Nintendo decided to charge an extra $20 for the SNES Classic on the grounds of there being an extra controller. Especially when you consider that an extra controller for the tiny NES is only 10 cold hard American dollars. And at the risk of sounding like a Nintendo fan man, I honestly think both consoles are worth $80. But there's just no other way to spin it in that forcing you to pay an extra $20 for another controller is an ass-hair off-putting, even if a second controller is more essential for the Super Nintendo games that were included. I mean, it's not like the SNES Mini's more powerful because the graphics are better, and that's not even considering that there's 9 fewer games on the Super Nintendo Classic, but the game selection's an entirely different point altogether, so we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. NES 1, SNES 0. Now to determine which has the better design, and as far as my monkey ass is concerned, this is a clear-cut choice. Both consoles look great, but the controller ports to the micro NES look a lot more natural, whereas you pretty much have to mutilate the tiny SNES just to play it. NES 2, SNES 0, and oh man, things are really suspenseful now, aren't they? I mean, one more point and the SNES Classic loses, damn it. I sure am on the edge of my ass right now. So let's continue on with the next point on which console has the better overall presentation. Both menus are fun, both controllers have cords that are too short and lack a reset button, and both consoles have save states. But the SNES Classic lets you rewind the last 90 seconds of every game you're playing and gives you the perfect opportunity to be a cheating bastard. Even though it's too little too late, seeing as how the games on the below average size Super Nintendo need this feature way less than the games on the NES Mini did. Still though, the fact remains that the SNES Classic's overall presentation's just an ass hair better thanks to this one feature. NES 2, SNES 1. Now for the final and deciding point, the games. Oh, wait, there's only 4 categories? Well, alright then, the 4th point goes to whichever has the better menu music. And oh my god, would you believe it? The SNES Classic wins, wow. I mean, geez, that was so close. Now it's come down to NES 2, SNES 2. Now we can determine which is the better overall console with the most important point. Which console has the better games? One might think the NES Classic Edition wins by default for having 30 games as opposed to the SNES Classic's 21. And to help the NES's case out even further, you don't have to jump through hoops just to unlock any of those 30 games, like having to beat the first stage of Star Fox 1 with your pinky up your ass just to unlock Star Fox 2. However, before we chalk this up as a battle between quantity versus quality, are the 21 SNES games really as good or better than the 30 on the NES? Well, I'm gonna break this down as thoroughly as possible by having the first ever point system within a point system to determine the final point, making this the most intense YouTube video of all time. Yeah! It's gonna be hard to divide the games up to comparable matches, but let's start with the Mario series. One of the most polarizing opinions in the history of video games is which game's better between Super Mario 3 and Super Mario World. And while I personally like Mario 3 better for nostalgia and for the fact that it's probably the best NES game of all time, I'd have to admit that Super Mario World is probably superior. However, it's irrelevant to get into that here since Super Mario 3, along with 2 and I guess 1 combined, are definitely better than Super Mario World, thus awarding the NES the first point. Then we have Mega Man 2 versus Mega Man X, which are the most popular games from both respective franchises. And although some people might be nostalgically attached to Mega Man 2, which I totally understand, Mega Man X is, in my opinion, far better in so many ways and is pretty much a perfect game for what it is. Don't get me wrong, Mega Man 2's great, but it just hasn't aged quite as well as X has, mainly to do with the issues with the boss weakness balance and certain parts of the game being impossible without specific weapons. Even if you're being nostalgic, Mega Man X still has a lot of that going for itself anyway, thus awarding a point to the Petite SNES. Then we have Castlevania 4 vs. 1, and for some reason 2. Castlevania 1's good, and 2 really isn't bad if you have the internet to help you out with the cryptic bullshit. But even though it's 2-on-1, I still gotta go with Castlevania 4. Some people think the whip in that game's overpowered, and I could totally see why some hardcore fans might prefer the original for challenge and nostalgia, but I've gotta go with 4 just for being more fun to play, and it also happens to be more accessible to the average person, awarding another point to the Petite SNES. As far as the Punch-Out series goes though, Super Punch-Out's probably better in every way, but I think the original holds up just as well as the sequel, and seeing how this one's pretty close in terms of raw quality, I've gotta go with regular Punch-Out, and not just because it's nostalgic. It's cause there's an overwhelming amount of nostalgia that Super Punch-Out can't even compare to, even with Mike Tyson being replaced with that greasy pedophile Mr. Dream. The bottom line is that whenever you mention Punch-Out, everybody's grandma knows about the NES version, and most people don't even know about the sequel on the Super Nintendo. NES 2, SNES 2. Moving on, we've got Super C vs. Contra 3. And although I like Super C's shorter adventure, Contra 3's just got way more going for it and is such a clear improvement over its predecessor that I can't deny its superiority. NES 2, SNES 3. And as far as Kirby games go, I'm a huge mark for Kirby's Adventure on the NES. But it's not even solely based on nostalgia. I just think it's a really good game, and it's mind-blowing to see something look this good on the NES. Kirby Superstar and Dream Course are great and all, and may technically have more to them, but I think they're kind of forgettable, or at least not as memorable as Kirby's Adventure is on the NES. So the NES gets the point here, despite there being a 2-on-1 advantage. However, while things may be tied up at this point, I'm not gonna drag this out longer than it needs to be just to get the video to the 10-minute mark, because the only games from the NES Mini that could even compare to the selection on the SNES Classic were the ones I just mentioned. From this point forward, the remaining SNES Classic games absolutely milk the remaining NES Classic games. I mean, come on. Final Fantasy 1 vs. 6? Metroid vs. Super Metroid? Lethal Weapon 3 vs. Time Cop 2? I know the NES has a higher quantity of remaining games, but the rest of the Super Nintendo games are absolute masterpieces. And I'm not saying the remaining NES games are bad, but the SNES lineup just has way more pep in its pee-pee. It absolutely perfected the kinds of games that the NES pioneered. While many of the NES Classic games still hold up rather well today, most of them rely on nostalgia, at least to some extent, whereas most of the games on the SNES Classic just hold up better and are more fun to play. As long as you don't hate RPGs anyway. So the final and deciding point in this intense and totally unpredictable battle goes to the SNES Classic Edition. Which Classic Edition console do you think is better though? Surely you disagree with me on some things, and if you're not gonna comment about what a swell guy I am, which is encouraged by the way, then feel free to let me know where you disagree in the comments below. Don't forget to like and share this video to help this channel grow, and if you're a premium cream of the crop sexy beast, then go ahead and press that subscribe button if you haven't already. My name's Cameron, and I'll see you next time.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.